have the growth prospects of African countries by sub-region as part of the continuous discussion. The regions that are fast growing are East Africa. This is usually driven by the improvements in construction sector, estates, industry, and the service sector, particularly by major economies such as Kenya and growing Ethiopia. Djibouti, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Tanzania are also doing well in the mining sector, particularly Djibouti in the area of trade logistics and its strategic position with access to the sea. Burundi suffered a bit, and that is for sure because of the prevalence of the conflict and the political instability for the last few years. And as a matter of discussion, you might have read a lot about structural transformation in the continent, and I would encourage you to discuss what structural transformation means to you and whether structural transformation has taken place in your country. The growth in West Africa is very good, we should say, particularly in Senegal and Cote d'Ivoire, but it is lower than East Africa. But it is on a very healthy trajectory. It is going well. But North Africa, despite its initial better economic performance, currently is having a lot of challenges with regards to political instability and inflation. Central Africa is helped by better commodity prices recently, but it suffered since June 2014 on that front because commodity price collapse happened in that period. And tourism is expanding on the positive note. Agribusiness is also expanding. In Southern Africa, not only South Africa itself, but commodity price rise has helped resource-rich economies. The only worrying trend in terms of the economic growth from a historical perspective is the growth of population, which is faster than the growth of the economies. And this really brings a structural challenge to all economies. Next, we will underline causes for the inflation. It is sometimes useful to go into some specific macroeconomic problems, such as fundamental ones like inflation. There are some policy changes in countries such as Ethiopia and Ghana, particularly from the central bank side, which led to the devaluation of the currency. So the exchange rate has been weakened. That might be useful for exports, but it is not useful for debt repayments. And both countries have mounting debts. Therefore, the servicing of debt, both for the principal of the debt amount borrowed, as well as the interest payments, are going to be a big challenge because of the devaluation of the currency and the denomination of most of the debts being in the US dollar. The removal of subsidy in some countries also led to inflation because that leads to price hikes, and consumers have to provide for extra claims on prices. Therefore, the inflation is contributed due to removal of subsidies or reduction of subsidies. And many central banks have also a loose monetary policy, and that is the third major cause of Africa's inflation. For sure, supply is going to be affected negatively because of political conflicts and regional tensions. The supply chain disruption leads to higher demand relative to supply, and that is directly reflected and felt badly by the population in terms of higher prices and inflation. There are shocks in terms of harvests from the agricultural sector, which affects food price hikes because of the collapse in agricultural production related to climate change challenges, and also because of the exchange rate fluctuations, plus the higher prices associated with importers. There are higher prices which are imported into the different countries in Africa. Now, another macroeconomic challenge is the widening fiscal deficit. In some countries and in some areas, we see a slight narrowing of the fiscal deficit problem, particularly given the efforts by many governments to increase the tax base. And also, in some cases, there is also tightening of fiscal budgets through what we call fiscal consolidation. But it should be done very carefully, because fiscal consolidation might suggest austerity, cutting back on expenditure on social services such as education, hospitals, health sector, investments in general. And the fiscal deficit narrowing also was because of the removal of subsidies, which really cuts back the cost of governments, but still helped fiscal deficit from being out of control. In terms of the future trajectory of the fiscal deficit, there are some important problems that we should keep an eye on. For instance, commitment to public investment has continued in many African countries. Therefore, that really put a lot of fiscal budget pressure. Therefore, government should really find the money to invest publicly. And we know the well-publicized external debt, which is mounting and growing from day to day, mainly because we have concessional as well as non-concessional loans from different creditors globally. And in Africa, there is a potential to raise funds through non-tax revenue instead of focusing only on tax revenue. And there is no improvement in that area as expected. But in future, we expect that governments also tap into non-tax revenue sources. And African continental level free trade area also leads to a loss in terms of particularly trade-related revenue. In terms of the trade links and also investment trajectory of many African countries, we see many African countries are doing the right thing and also improving their trade and investment scene. That led to a shrinking of the current account deficits, particularly if we are talking about exports and imports in goods, excluding services. We know that in services, Africa is not a major player. The capital account couldn't improve as expected, particularly the current account coming from foreign direct investment. In future, we expect that it should improve, particularly with interest from multinational companies from abroad. One of the realities that we should really, or the facts that we should remember, is that inter-Africa trade is diversified and is mainly in low-tech manufacturing. We feel that this might give a scope for industrialization, but I want you to interrogate this and think about this more carefully. And the intercontinental efforts such as African-wide continental free trade area might help to promote what we want in terms of really promoting trade among African countries, or what we call intra-Africa trade. Not only trade, but trade-related investment, or also capital-related investment through interaction between African governments might be the reality that we should be benefiting from, and that will bring a positive thing to the continent. There are barriers to trade, both tariff-related and non-tariff-related, and they will be dismantled because of the free trade area. Therefore, we expect better flows of trade and investment among African countries because of the free trade area, the continent-wide free trade area agreement that is recently signed and being ratified gradually by many African countries. Trade is better among African countries, but investment is not that large, therefore it is generally low. We feel that in some cases there are researchers who suggest that inter-Africa investment might be used for money laundering and capital flight, as a scandal exposures to banks in advanced countries and tax havens is increasing globally. Therefore, if any money laundering is happening from Africa, it may not really be at an international scale. Maybe it might be between within African countries. Therefore, there is an issue there, particularly with regards to flows of funds between countries within the continent. In services, there are interesting investments expanding, which is encouraging. And there are also merger and acquisitions, which are also happening within Africa in the area of investments. Finally, I will I will show you the foreign direct investment that is coming from USA, which is on the light green color, and the foreign direct investment that is coming from China over the last 10 years, but the cutoff point being 2007 to 2017. I think I want to highlight two facts in this. One, the foreign direct investment coming from USA, which is on the upper end, is larger than the foreign direct investment coming from China. Another important fact is that there are fluctuations in the foreign direct investment coming from USA. For instance, if you look the period between 2012 and 2015, you have a rise and also a sharp drop. However, if you look the trend from China right away from the start point 2007 up to the last point of observation, 2017, it is monotonically increasing. Therefore, there is a narrowing between the foreign direct investment that is coming from the USA and China. Therefore, China is expected to catch up with the USA in terms of investing in the continent. And this is a very interesting trend that you need to keep an eye on in terms of foreign direct investment from these two countries to our continent. The second related figure is not on investment, but on trade. Now the roles are reversed. If you look at starting from 2007, the contribution of USA in light green and the contribution of China in purple, they were similar for a year. But after that, they have diverged. China has more trade with Africa than America. America has a lower version. It is fluctuating in a similar pattern, but in recent years, the foreign trade, both exports and imports from China to Africa, has really been very, very, very high. And the gap between the trade that America is having with Africa and the trade that China is having with Africa is widening. Both are increasing, but the one from China is sharply increasing. As you can see, the slope of the curve is very, very sharp compared to the flat slope that you witness from the graph for USA. So in terms of investment, better from USA, but the gap is narrowing. China is catching up. In terms of trade, China is really leaving USA behind, and it is trading much, much highly with Africa. And the gap between the two countries doesn't seem to converge, and China is running away with a leading position in terms of trade relationship with the continent. And on the social side, we have concluded the economic development in Africa. On the social side, we will focus on human capital, such as education, health, and outcomes such as poverty and inequality. The social development scenarios that we see in Africa shows the shallow foundations of African economic development over 5 decades. It is not only for this decade, but over the last 50 years, the social development scene it has a very, very weak foundation. Public expenditure in health and education is increasing encouragingly, but poverty is very, very widespread and inequality is persistent. And Africa should really address these challenges, which is really keeping a lot of millions of Africans in very, very bad situations. The only region where the number of poor has grown since 1990 is in Africa. The poverty gap, which we can use as a very imperfect measure of inequality, is almost double. And that is even double that of the global average of 8.8%. Therefore, inequality, poverty is expanding in Africa. Unemployment is about 7% if we use ILO definition. However, I don't usually trust such figures. I suspect the unemployment figure in Africa should be much, much higher because we know the reality of youth unemployment, unemployment of women, and lack of economic empowerment for our society. The informal economy is very important. I have a positive view of the informal economy in the continent. It should be supported. Service should be provided for informal sector operators. And it is a major employer, especially for women, youth, and now most university graduates. They don't go and work for public and private institutions, but they work in the informal sector. They are self-employed. They are trying to sustain themselves through informal sector economic activity. And it is very important, and this really makes Africa very different from other continents in terms of provision of employment. Important improvements have been gained in Africa in child survival rates, but maternal mortality is still a problem. We have coverage of primary schooling and literacy in the improvement side, but that is not enough because quality should be also improving, not only just going to school, but good education is important. Social spending is expanding in countries such as Ethiopia, Kenya, and Nigeria, particularly to help very poor families, but it should be more widespread and a lot scaled up over the continent. Because most of the social protection spending is aid funded, and if aid from advanced countries is cut, I think the social safety net budget will suffer. But that is part of the phenomena that Africa has to go through, because what happens globally in advanced countries also affects its economy as well as its social development, particularly in this case through cuts of aid money for social safety net. In conclusion, for the social development side, we can say that for policy, there is a need for improving public finance management when it is allocated for building schools and hospitals. There is a need to expand fiscal space for Africa to get the money to fund its sustainable development. And there is a need to invest in education, but not only on its quantity, but also in quality. The same with hospitals and health. Africa is very, very behind the rest of the planet in terms of investing on research and development. Technology investment should increase, and also agricultural productivity in relation to forward as well as backward linkage with industries should expand. And social protection is at the heart of protecting people from dire poverty and unemployment, and we should really support the vulnerable and the poor in society. That is the end of session 1 and module 1 of the fiscal policy course, and I would be very happy to continue to session 2.